Hi there, and welcome to Shapers, Makers, Builders, and Breakers. I'm your host today, Benjamin Shaw. Shapers is the podcast show that brings you African leadership stories in all spheres of society, where we interview exceptional individuals telling us their story.
This podcast is brought to you by Exeo Capital. Exeo Capital is a leading alternative private equity fund manager that through its 15-year history have focused on investing in African businesses with purpose and impact. Exeo covers the whole of the African continent with investment teams based in Cape Town, South Africa and Nairobi, Kenya, currently managing investments in 9 African countries. The core investment thesis revolves around partnering with exceptional businesses and their teams that have the ability to impact Africa in the decades to come. Exeo does this through providing growth capital to these businesses, but more than that, leveraging a partnership ethos with the companies they invest in. For more information, please have a look at their website, www.exeocapital.com. That is www.exeocapital.com.
Since the start of the Shapers podcast, the approach to interviews has remained the same. Engage in peer-to-peer conversations by asking the questions that we would most like the answers to.
We hope that you will enjoy today's conversation as much as we enjoyed recording it. Without any further delay, let's dive into our next episode of Shapers, Makers, Builders, and Breakers.
We're following a political and global leadership theme on the pod at the moment. Following the superb episode with Jordan Hill-Lewis, today it's a great pleasure to welcome Ronak Gopaldas onto the show. Ronak describes his role as explaining Africa to the world and the world to Africa, and he's a political economist by background. He's better known for his writings and keynote speeches which unpack the intersection of geopolitics, business and economics, and he previously led the country risk division at RMB. Ronak is a director of signal risk and a research fellow at Nanyang Technological University, so it's a big welcome to the show. Ronak, why don't you start by giving us a bit of background? How does someone move from study all the way to the head of a bank's country risk division, and what does that actually mean?
Hi, Ben. Great to be with you, and it's a pleasure to be here on the podcast. It's a great question, and I wish I could give you a straightforward answer, but it's, I guess, quite a complicated one. I think most people in corporates who kind of achieve leadership positions or any level of success have 3 things in common. So I think hard work is a given. You've got to really kind of prove yourself and work hard and put in the hard yards. Then I think you need a sponsor, and I was very fortunate in my career, especially early in my career, to have bosses that really backed me. And then I think third is luck. You need to be in the right place at the right time. And I think all of those were pretty important and influential in me getting to where I got at RMB. So that's the kind of logical answer. I guess the more woo-woo answer is that maybe it was kind of written in the stars. You know, ever since I was a kid, I had this passion for current affairs, news, political and economic analysis. I would read the newspapers as a kid and wait for my dad to get home and he'd quiz me about what I read. I would, try and memorize capital cities, going through an atlas. At school, I'd win current affairs prizes and general knowledge prizes. So I was kind of always really into this stuff. And so obviously went to UCT and then did a politics, philosophy and economics degree, PPE, which my mom called party, etc. I guess, there was always that raw passion there. And I wanted to actually be a journalist back in the day. So very much an accidental banker. But again, to this point about being in the right place at the right time, in 2009, I did an internship at RMB just as the bank was expanding its country risk team, was expanding heavily across Africa. And kind of the guy leading that team took a liking to me, and I joined the graduate program the next year, and the rest is history. So, I guess not really a straightforward answer, but combination of hard work, right people backing me, and a little bit of luck, I guess, or a lot of luck.
Maybe just explain a little bit more about the risk, the country risk office in a bank. There's obviously various pockets of risk that get analyzed. You've got credit from credit all the way through to market risk, FX changes. And then what I would expect a banker's risk or country risk department to be doing is analyzing Moody's and Fitch reports and sort of adjusting relative risk measures across Africa. What was it that you actually did?
Yeah, so I think you kind of got the broad gist of it. At the time that I joined, country risk was still a relatively new and evolving discipline. It didn't really fit into a neat box and use models or quantifiable metrics like many of the other types of risk that you have in a bank. And it was only kind of in the aftermath of the global financial crisis and the European sovereign debt crisis that people really started paying attention to it. There were obviously a lot of question marks around the ratings agencies, whether they were asleep at the wheel during the GFC and things like that. And so there was a real strong push for banks to develop their own country risk methodologies, to have independent functions so that they weren't too reliant on the ratings agencies, who perhaps weren't as nimble as they could have been, right? So it's still a relatively new discipline, but and I think if you ask most people what they think of country risk, whether it's an art or a science, whether it's subjective or objective, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, I think you'll get loads of different answers. I think the one thing that I would emphasize is that compared to other risk functions in a bank, which tend to be quite internal and transaction specific, this was quite multifactorial. It required an interdisciplinary skill set, and it focused a lot on the external environment. And the models and frameworks that you use to quantify things were useful, but they weren't enough, because ultimately country risk is a judgment. And consequently, that requires a very different skill set. So, practically speaking, whenever we do a cross-border deal at a bank, country risk was at the apex of that. The rating that we would assign would influence pricing, the commercial viability of a deal. We'd need to kind of anticipate and mitigate the risks. And that was really cool, because there were a lot of complex factors at play, and we would need to kind of solve the problem as to how to mitigate a lot of the risks. So a lot of report writing, a lot of assessing and anticipating macro developments, but also mapping that to risk appetite, the investment philosophy, and the bank's comparative advantage. And for me, being at the coalface of that in my 20s and working on some of the biggest deals in Africa was really amazing. And the exposure that I got, just meeting ministers, central bank governors, traveling to over 20 countries on the continent was just stuff I dreamt of.
Amazing. And would it be fair for me to brand or have people rebranded this country risk element as geopolitics in today's vernacular, or do you see those as separate disciplines?
They're used quite interchangeably. I would agree with you. Okay. But country risk is a pretty broad term which encapsulates geopolitics, political risk, security, economic policy risk, liquidity risk. So I would kind of classify it, broadly speaking, under the overarching theme of country risk.
Okay. So country risk being broad, geopolitics being a narrow part of country risk. Just for my own curiosity, were your clients internal or were you client facing? So were there deal makers coming to you for advice within the bank, or did you go and see your bank's clients and give them their own independent report?
So when I was running the country risk team, the clients were primarily internal clients. Okay. So it would be the traders trading, African FX, Eurobonds, things like that. Would be the various teams in the bank on the lending side, for example, the oil and gas and the mining team, the property team. We'd obviously have to get our ratings and reports approved by the Central Credit Committee, and obviously, deal with the risk function, but also balance that with the transactors who were ultimately the clients. The primary function was internal, although I used to still do a lot of media work at the time and kind of share a lot of our views in the public domain.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating thought, that the specialization that you would have brought to that set of information would almost be market moving or market leading, let's say, where people would rely on you for information, and by you giving information, you might actually affect the risk profile or the perception of risk in some of what you're analyzing. I suppose a bank as large as RMB would do that regardless, and I'm sure there were many Chinese walls between deals that were taking place.
Yeah. And I think that you highlight a really important function, which is the independence of the country risk function, right? Because deal makers are incentivized by their bonus structures, by closing deals where, if they do that, they're incentivized and they get big bonuses. At the same time, you've got to have an independent function within a bank to kind of call things objectively and as you see it, right? And that healthy tension was important just from a corporate governance perspective, but also in terms of making sure that there was proper debate, there was proper accountability, and there was transparency in the way deals were priced and in the way commercial decisions were made.
Well, I remember joining the banking workforce just a few years on, and RMB was known at the time for the most successful deals done on the continent. So that's certainly testament to the process that was working. You mentioned a bit earlier the rating agencies that you were almost checking in on them or giving some independence to their view post GFC. We actually still, in terms of private equity, a lot of practitioners will still do independent analysis and work on the African countries. Part of that is also many of the rating agencies are focused on the developed world rather than Africa. And so I've got sort of two follow-up comments. Firstly, was there clear divergence between how Africans view Africa and or not? And then secondly, you're going to tell us a bit about your move from South Africa into the UK. Was that also informed by a differing view on risk, or what were the drivers of that?
Great questions. So look, I think the ratings agencies tend to get a lot of flack, and I kind of do feel a bit of sympathy for them because they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. If they move too quickly, then they move markets. If they wait, then they're seen as reactive. And it's kind of a bit of a poison chalice. So I do feel a level of sympathy for them. But at the same time, there are lots of question marks around whether their methodologies are fit for purpose. Can, apply the same criteria to Spain as you do Burundi, for example. And these are I guess some of the broader existential questions around ratings agencies. And you often hear of a lot of governments criticizing ratings agencies and a push towards kind of a global South rating agency or an African credit ratings agency. But I think that's the ratings agencies have a role. And an important role to play. They're a signpost, but they're not the be-all and end-all. And I would advise any company or any analyst that they would need to supplement what the ratings agencies do with their own analysis, right? And I think to that point, models are great at predicting the last crisis. But they're not great at having predictive power, particularly in the domain of country risk, where ultimately it comes down to being a judgment. So you try and make that judgment as objective as possible, and you try and make the process as robust with peer reviews, with cross-country comparisons, with a lot of data. But ultimately, there's experience, there's intuition as well that also goes into informing this kind of analysis. So I would say definitely, the ratings agencies are an important first step, but I think should be complemented with internal methodologies, consulting with other experts, and with proprietary analysis as well.
And that obviously did work, given, as I say, the successful deals that were executed at RMB over your time there. So I guess by implication, it means you probably had a few divergent views from those agencies, at least for a time. How did that change, or did it change then, moving from South Africa, from an Africa focus into the world, into a world focus back onto Africa?
Yeah, that's another interesting question. I think one of the big changes or differences now, having a consultancy and being, I guess, independent and being able to service a wide range of clients, both international and domestic, is that, we can kind of call it as we see it. We're objective and independent, and a lot of the, I guess, internal tensions that you have at a big organization are less of an issue. And I think, I'm very grateful for my banking experience because it gave me the kind of perspective around how commercial decision makers like to be communicated to and what's important to them. For example, taking the impact of macro developments and translating that into what they mean for financial markets, what they mean for the policy environment, what they mean for the business environment and the real economy, is a skill and that I learned within the banking environment. But I think, coming to London was more of a personal decision than anything else. I wanted to test myself amongst the best and the brightest in the world and see how good I really was. I kind of view my life in chapters, and I felt that, being a Joburg boy, having worked at RMB for 8 years, it was probably time for a change. Now, my approach was a little bit unconventional. I kind of jumped and tried to stitch the parachute on the way down. I moved to London with no plan, no job, no income, which, as you'll know, rands don't go very far over here. But sometimes I think, when you really want something, the universe gives it back to you in abundance. And, now 7 years later, it's been a very, very interesting journey. I've learned a lot, obviously taken out of a comfort zone. The culture is completely different here. The level of thinking is different. And I think, that obviously leads to changes in how you present your information, the way you think about things, and how you communicate to different audiences. Because, now communicating to an international audience, communicating to a domestic audience across, asset managers, across banks, across think tanks, across corporate institutions, I think has been a huge learning curve. And, the other thing is that it's given me a real appreciation of what South Africa is and what it isn't.
Well, I'd love to hear a bit more about that. I mean, if I was to sort of re-articulate what I'm taking from what you've just shared, the opportunity to compete with the best in the world, that I can relate to and understand. But you're also exporting African insight. You built a team around you for 8 years. We've got a lot of people who join the pod, and we talk about African leadership across various spheres of society. How did you find you competed in the world as existed in London 7 years ago?
I think when you come to a new environment as an outsider, it's always going to be a little bit of a challenge to understand the culture, the landscape. You don't necessarily have the social capital you have back home. London's a big place. People are quite individualistic and time poor. So, it's a constant hustle and a rat race. I think what I did learn is that, people aren't necessarily smarter here. The depth and the breadth which they cover and the time frame in which they cover it is just different. And I think there is a level of upskilling in terms of how quickly you synthesize information, how you communicate it, how you are able to build the cultural intelligence to communicate with different audiences, and understand that, where I think, I didn't necessarily always have that exposure in South Africa. So I definitely think South Africans are really hardworking people who can compete globally, and who can definitely thrive in a global setting. And you see that all over the place. You see it in every industry. And I think it just kind of requires a bit of an adjustment and a recalibration. And obviously, things are just different. They're not right or wrong. They're just very different to how they are back home. And I think I'm very grateful for the experience.
Well, I'm very grateful you still call South Africa home. That's good news for us. Maybe you could just double click a little bit on the risk assessment part of your job. You've moved from a bank where you mentioned your clients were effectively internal. They were the bank. You were providing independent advice. And now you're fully independent in your own firm. how would you share or identify risks with clients in this sort of new framework? And maybe you could share how it is you would break down the risks that can be assessed if you're doing the work for them.
Yeah, so I mean, let's take it at a macro level now, because a lot of the clients I speak to are, they're quite hesitant and quite nervous about looking at risk in Africa, and a lot of the key part of the discussion is about how you frame the challenges and the opportunities on the continent. So, I always kind of lead with the fact that Africa is simply too big to ignore. By the year 2050, right, 1 in 4 people in the world are going to be from Africa, going to play a major role in global production and consumption, largest working age youth population in the world by then. So whether we like it or not, if we don't solve the challenges in Africa, they're going to become global issues. Then the second thing, right, in terms of framing is that, our risks are our rewards and our challenges are our opportunities in Africa. And I think that's, in a world where there's a lot of Afro-pessimism, that's an important distinction to make, and really helps investors and clients to think about things through a different paradigm. Then the third thing,
so when you're talking to clients about that, are they typically looking to enter the market? Are they looking to assess the market? What is the intention behind their request of your services, your input?
It's varied. So we've got a pretty broad range of clients, from security managers to asset managers to corporate treasurers to corporate finance folks. So the different levels of sophistication. But what we pride ourselves on doing at Signal Risk is being a one-stop shop for covering every country on the continent. We've got a subscription service which provides daily updates. We go into issue briefings. We do monthly risk assessments with dashboards and risk ratings. So we're an African firm covering Africa with a lot of experience. So typically, with the way we cover things, it can service a lot of different clients, those who are more focused on the political side of things, those who are more focused on the economic side of things. And because we take an interdisciplinary approach, we find that we're able to kind of cover a big universe of clients.
Right. Thank you.
So then
back to your third.
Back to the third point is, I always say to people, because Africa is not industrialized, it's a continent where you can do well and you can do good simultaneously. So if you solve a social challenge, you can make a lot of money. And I think that is a pretty compelling value proposition. So, I joke and I say these days, I'm not a banker, I'm a corporate sangoma. And I try and kind of provide frameworks and kind of help folks anticipate what they need to know in the future. But I like to play in the gray areas and help move clients from places of uncertainty and fear to a position where they can identify, understand, and then mitigate the risk. And there's a lot of risk out there at the moment. Globally, the pandemic and the Ukraine war has really exposed the governance and financial fissures between the global north and south. It's reshaped the global political and economic architecture. The international rules-based order is being challenged. And in Africa as well, in the past 10 years, we had Ebola, we had the commodity price crash, we had COVID, we had a debt crisis, we had the impact of the Ukraine war. And that's why we're seeing this protest contagion. And I think both globally and in Africa, we're seeing these fundamental shifts, which is creating risk. Social contracts are under the microscope, and we know that social contracts are either rewritten, reformed, or rejected. And I think because there's so much uncertainty, it makes the work that we do quite important in strategic decision making.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I'm sold. Absolutely right. And that's it's even what we're seeing, not at a capital allocator level, but even at the operator level. I loved what you said about solving a challenge here allows you to make money. Solving social issues is actually a money-making opportunity. And I'm curious as to whether you see interested clients of yours seeing Africa as an impact cause, or whether they are predominantly looking at commercial opportunities and saying that is good in and of itself.
So a bit of both. And I think most folks recognize that the commercial returns and the impact are linked, right? So I don't think they're mutually exclusive, and I think that's generally the sentiment that a lot of our clients are um, is evident with a lot of our clients. I think, if you look at the domain of climate finance, for example, that's one area where, there's a lot of money and there's a lot of lucrative commercial opportunities, but then also the impact of getting this right and facilitating the climate transition is also very important from a developmental perspective. So,
and does that make Africa quite an attractive destination for interested investors?
Definitely. I mean, look, there are challenges, regulatory challenges, FX challenges, political challenges, but the trick is in how clients are able to, or investors are able to navigate that, right? Is kind of assessing the risk, identifying it, and finding structures or strategies to mitigate that. Because I think, especially in the wake of the Ukraine war, where Russian gas was not available to Europe anymore, that kind of catalyzed a new wave of interest, particularly in the green energy space across Africa. And I think there's significant opportunities now that are emerging for investment, particularly from Western counterparties.
That's exactly right, and so interesting. I know we're jumping around a bit, but you've just triggered a thought here that outside of the gas crisis in Europe because of the Russian gas being withheld, there was also a sense or a return to the sense of nationalism that seemed to happen, where systems didn't want to, or governments didn't want their systems to be as reliant on the globe, and we're seeing particular politicians sort of campaign on that now, thinking of our North American brothers and sisters. Is that a political sort of changing of the winds? Do you see it as a particular sort of personality driving that narrative, or is that generally what we're seeing around the globe? We certainly read the stories of Europe and the UK in sort of painted by the similar brush to the US at the moment.
Yeah, I think it is a general theme, and to try and understand it, I think we need to go back in history. So for a long time we had the Cold War, clash between the Soviets and the US up until the collapse of the Berlin Wall. We had some pretty seismic events in the 1989-1990 period, which fundamentally changed the course of the world. It was the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the end of communism, the release of Nelson Mandela from prison, Tiananmen Square, etc. And that kind of unleashed the era of globalism, democratization, and capitalism. And that was pretty much the only show in town for a number of decades. Until it was punctured by the financial crisis in 2008. Then we had austerity, then we had quantitative easing, and we had the rise of social media. And I think in 2020, we had another pretty big inflection point where the zeitgeist changed. We entered into a pretty seismic global moment where you had this clash between liberalism and authoritarianism. You had the pandemic, which saw an economic crisis in both the developed and developing world. You saw the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. We were in the horns of a climate emergency. And so there was a pretty big political moment, which caused a big rupture. And I think the shift towards this era of more nationalism, more isolationism, and more authoritarianism was kind of unlocked in that moment. And I've mentioned the issue of social contracts being under threat, but we can see it on a global level in terms of the UN Security Council, in terms of global bodies, in terms of how countries have voted on the Ukraine resolutions at the UN Security Council, and this division between the global North and global South, which had been building for a long, long time, from the vaccine diplomacy story to the very binary view on the war, from the debt crisis to the the climate stuff. I think all of these have led to this fragmentation, and the old rules-based order, which we lived by for a long time, is under threat at the moment. So I definitely think we are in an era of more isolationism and more nationalism, and because of that, we're seeing this great power competition emerging. We're seeing the rise of the BRICS Plus. We're seeing push towards de-dollarization. So a lot of things are in flux at the moment, and they have to do fundamentally with the global political architecture no longer being fit for purpose.
Sure. I mean, again, that's so interesting. My thesis, in fact, one of the reasons I was so excited to have you on the pod, Ronak, is because I really believe there's an erosion of trust in sort of the authorities, quote unquote, such that you're seeing the demise of journalism in a number of sectors. You've got obvious examples of public institutions letting people down, whether that's information about COVID or policies that clearly served a purpose beyond just health and wellness. And then you've got, as you just pointed out, and I hadn't made the link, you've got these sort of authoritarian figures coming back to arrest that, to say, actually, don't disseminate all information to all people. Come via me, and I'll make sure that it's truth. You mentioned social media. Is it a function of the democratization of information that we are almost burdened now with this I choose my own truth? Or do you think that there's more of a reaction just to the last few years' events that are kind of swung the pendulum that way, and it's completely reversible and normal and going to head back the other way in the coming years?
No, I think you're spot on with your assessment, right? So the reason social contracts are under threat is because there's a lack of trust in political leadership. And because there's this vacuum, people are being pushed to the fringes, right? And the thing with strongman leaders with social media is that they push simple solutions to complex problems, and that resonates, and it's easy to go
build the wall.
Yeah, it's easy to go viral in an age of disinformation and misinformation, and so we're living in an era where there is a massive trust deficit in societies, and the political leadership that we currently have is seemingly not up to the task and is not responsive or agile enough to understand, right? And I think Tony Blair made the point this week around the role of centrist politics and the role of centrist politics to be solution oriented, and it's kind of lost that. I think about the era in which I grew up in, where you had statesmen like Mandela, Clinton, Blair, who were selling visions and values of the future that were based on hope and optimism. And I think in the wake of the financial crisis, which has, I think, a lot to do with what's emerged and the rise of Trumpism and Brexit and this more inward-looking approach, I think basically what you've had is that it's a function of the context as well, where people don't feel that their lives are going to get better. They have been hit with one crisis after another. The cost of living is unsustainable, and consequently they're looking for scapegoats, which is why you're seeing this emergence of a very toxic form of politics in many places, because the political system and the political leaders are no longer trusted.
Yeah, it's spot on, and you can see that the difference between a leader like what you've got in Argentina, actually going back to selling hope and optimism and goals for the future, and what a breath of fresh air.
Well, even South Africa, I would argue, Ben. I think
okay, you think GNU is... yeah, I'd love to hear the view of that, and particularly actually looking outside in, what is the perception of South Africa and the government of national unity that's been put together?
So this is a fascinating divergence that I've observed between folks who are in South Africa versus people who are looking at South Africa from the outside in. And I think a lot of external investors and observers and analysts of South Africa are starting to get really enthused and excited about the progress. And, I speak to folks on the ground and they're jaded. They kind of feel like, they don't want to be scammed again, like it's Ramaphosa 2.0. They're more hesitant and they're more cautious. they have to live the dysfunction. So, I get the sentiment and the reasons behind that. But I think, international investors with maybe less of an emotional attachment, with a broader set of comparative examples like Mexico, like Turkey, etc., are looking at things in South Africa and starting to say, this place looks like it's going to be turning the corner. We've had political change and a sentiment shift. And I think, I'm one of those people that is starting to get excited as well. And that's driven by a lot of factors. So I think for the last 10 years, pretty much, investors in financial markets have dumped South African assets, and I think they look really cheap now. And with this political change and goodwill, I think we're going to see, and we have started to see, a bit of a rally. I think from a fiscal and monetary coordination perspective, the central bank has been really good with its inflation targeting. It maintains its independence in a world where central banking is getting more populist. And now with the proposal of the fiscal rule, I think that coordination will enthuse investors. No load shedding in 4 months now? I think the key engines of economic growth, from energy to transport to logistics, are starting to be repaired. If you look at it from an investment perspective, big international companies like Heineken, Microsoft, PepsiCo, Amazon are making big bets on South Africa, and that's serious money. So I'm hoping that this unlocks the domestic private sector to get behind things and unlocks these animal spirits, and they start to kind of invest as well. And then there's this innate South African resilience which you can't really quantify, but you go to the brink and you come back. And so I'm kind of the view now that the direction of travel is positive. As we know in South Africa, it's never linear. It's always one step forward, 2 steps back. But I think the trend lines, from what I'm seeing and my analysis, suggest that there's new life in our polity, and it's up to us to seize the moment now. And I think, of course, the political calendar, the ANC elective conference, the local government elections are all kind of potential obstacles. But I think, more broadly speaking, I think in a world where authoritarianism is rising, South Africa managed a peaceful transition where a liberation party lost power. There was nobody out on the streets. It was done seamlessly and voluntarily. And I think that and we know all about the courts and the independence of the courts and the institutions that we have in South Africa, and how they've kind of protected us against nefarious behavior. So I think if you take it holistically and you strip out a bit of the emotion, the data points suggest that things are moving in a positive direction.
Gee, that is very, very positive, and so good to hear people outside of the country with that viewpoint. I suppose to take the other side, that would be the bull case. The bear case might be, for example, the lack of transportation infrastructure that's sort of been lamented for many years and still not quite fixed. And then in the financial markets, you said, private sector's got to step up. I agree with that. I think the JSE is making strides to make it easier, but there is still a wave of delistings taking place. And until we've got slightly better parity on the exchange rates, there's also always this feeling that the South African earners want to be offshore with their wealth as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Which is probably a perception that will take many, many years to sort of change as the pendulum swings. Perhaps you could give us a view. That's, I guess, my response to a bull case. What about Africa holistically? What is the bull and the bear, and your company's called Signal Risk? What are the signals or the flags that you're looking for to determine direction of travel?
Complex question. So I think if we take stock of the landscape holistically, we are in an era of great power competition globally, and Africa is strategically important for any global power if they're going to achieve their aspirations. And so what we're seeing is that both emerging and established powers are courting Africa and trying to sell their vision and their value set for the future. And we've seen this across vaccine diplomacy, summits, critical minerals, technological access, financial and political reform. And so global powers are playing I guess, geopolitical chess over here, and they're playing it on 4 dimensions. So, number one is obviously money. Number 2 is muscle, military power. Number 3 is the medium of communication, which is obviously speaks to the tech issues. And then number 4 is the messaging and the soft power. And what we are starting to see is that, there's a narrative that there's a Cold War 2.0 happening, and we've been here in the past. And Africa holistically has an opportunity here to either be kingmaker or piggy in the middle. You want to avoid the exploitation that happened last time. And so the approach needs to be very pragmatic rather than ideological, because this time around, you want a seat at the table, not to be on the menu. And I think there's a real opportunity here to leverage strategic diplomacy and to manage global powers in a way that is strategically convenient and draws in investment. Now, from an African perspective, and again, not to generalize around the continent holistically, but I think there are a lot of common challenges and opportunities that need to be resolved. And I think how leadership and policymakers in various countries navigates 5 tensions. The tension between politics, between democracy and development, the tension between globalism and protectionism, the demographic tension between old leaders and young populations, the geopolitical tension between the East and the West, and the technological tension between kind of leapfrogging or lagging, is going to determine how countries develop and what their development path is. Because I think we're very much at an inflection point here, where we've had a number of poor years, which have really stymied the continent's progress. But how we resolve these tensions are going to determine how countries emerge, and whether they're going to be victims or victors in this changing geopolitical landscape. And I think there is an opportunity right now to exercise agency and to make strategic decisions that are conducive to foreign investment and kind of flexing muscle on a global stage.
Wow, that's a very powerful framework you've given us to look through. I'll need to reflect a bit, I think, to understand where I'd be looking for the signals. I suppose FX is, foreign exchange is supposed to be an approximation for relative risk, and Africa traditionally, certainly in the last decade or so, has underperformed, was performed very poorly against or relative to developed world. Do you see this as a lack of information, so incomplete information about Africa, its performance and its opportunities? Do you think it would change in this sort of next decade, this next phase, or this next chapter? And maybe also just, do you think that work that you're doing and Signal Risk is doing is actually going to be shedding light on those arbitrage opportunities?
Yeah, as we mentioned, it's been a terrible few years for the continent, first through the pandemic and then through the Ukraine war, which, in times of risk aversion, what tends to happen is that the dollar strengthens. There's, a flight of capital
to
away
the treasury
from risky assets to safe assets. And consequently, there's contagion. And in a context where the revenue lines are extremely narrow in most of these economies, which tend to be single commodity exporters, when this happens globally, it's got massive knock-on effects, and we saw that during both the pandemic and the Ukraine war, where countries were simply locked out of capital markets. A number of countries, Ghana, Ethiopia, and Zambia, defaulted on their debt. Currencies went for a spin, and consequently, you had inflation rising as well. So the reality is that given the current financial architecture, this is going to happen every time there is a kind of risk-off event, or every time you have what's called the dollar smile, where the dollar strengthens in times of great uncertainty, but it also strengthens in times when the U.S. economy is strong and performing well, and achieving maximum employment, right? So, and we've seen that as well, where to protect against overheating and higher inflation, the Fed has raised interest rates, and again that's had negative contagion on African economies. So the reality is that unless countries can develop domestic capital markets to reduce this dependency on external financing sources, this is going to happen periodically, and in times of great risk aversion. So I think there is also generally quite poor understanding of the factors that drive the exchange rates in many countries. Take South Africa, for example, where 60 to 70% of what drives the rand is driven by external developments, and only about 30 to 40% by local developments. Now, obviously, the domestic factors are magnified in a risk-averse environment, but generally, there's so many things that explain the rand. It's a proxy for general emerging market risk sentiment, and so there is a lot of misunderstanding of the factors that drive the financial dynamics in various countries. And if you extend this to the performance of Eurobonds in Africa, which are driven by both push and pull factors, right? So I've mentioned the impact of the Fed and its hiking cycle and what that's done to what African sovereigns are paying, but at the same time, when it's a more benign environment, there's a flood of money chasing high yielding assets. So it's a pretty complex thing to explain in a couple of minutes, but I think that kind of paints a broad picture and again illustrates the need for domestic capital markets so that African countries are less dependent on boom bust scenarios and this kind of level of volatility that they typically face.
Yeah, I think that's well said. For me, a few of the takeaway points, not just from what you've shared, but in the reading I've done, the one is the strongest economies are positioned to stay the strongest economies, and it's in their best interest to do so. So you're fighting an uphill battle trying to become relatively stronger. The second, as you very eloquently articulated, is the necessity of strong local capital markets. It's a point we've made a few times actually on this platform. The need for liquidity in the market is one of the strongest factors for strength, because you're able to stimulate growth just by money turning over, transactions being done, deals being done, exits being had. And the perception of wealth then can become quite quickly the sort of the realization of it. And then, and happy for you to agree or disagree with anything I say here, but the other big factor in Africa is the cost of living is just so, it's so materially different. It's orders of magnitude different to the rest of the world, or certainly American, the US dollar living, that in some cases it divorces the need for the level of wealth accretion that's happening there. And so you've got, sure, if you're comparing foreign buyers coming locally, they find it very cheap. But actually, net, they're paying very similar portions of their salary or their income to do things you can do here for a similar portion of your salary. And that speaks to your central bank policy and the Reserve Bank here being very strong on inflation.
Yeah. I think you make a very compelling point. Just to add to that, I think if you look at the financing avenues that most African sovereigns have, in the wake of the pandemic and the Ukraine war, a lot of them were closed off, which is why we've seen so many sovereigns get into IMF programs, which is something typically they only do kicking and screaming because of the historical aversion from the structural adjustment programs of the 80s. So you're locked out of international capital markets because the cost of capital is too high. Domestic interest rates are north of 20%, so that's not a viable option. China, in the wake of COVID, has become more selective and closed the taps and altered its approach to lending. So then, what are the avenues that you've got left, right? So you can go to get bilateral loans or concessional finance, and the Gulf have made a lot of noise around their lending in Africa. But then ultimately, in the absence of these alternatives, most countries have gone to the IMF, which again, the question marks around sovereignty and independence and all of this kind of stuff, but they were out of options. And I think if you look at that holistically, I think, again, it drives the need for reduced dependency and more localized solutions so that we can avoid this kind of stuff going forward.
Sure. Yeah, the independence is, that need is clear. And I also hope we're going to see more people invested in this in the success of Africa, because it'll be in their own self-interest. I mean, you pointed out the 1 in 4 people by 2050. I'm curious if we just zoom out now from investment and the focus on putting money into work on the continent. If we're looking at that demographic, are those sort of migration flows what we're starting to see the sort of the echoes of into Europe? Is that quite divorced? Are those just humanitarian crises different to where Africa is expanding? And what would be good positioning in the next 10, 20 years for that inevitability?
You mean Africans leaving Africa to go elsewhere?
Yes, and being welcomed into some countries and sort of denied access into others. Appreciate that this is also a year of, I think, is it 70 elections across the world? So probably some political posturing as well. But what is the medium term best case scenario for the world in absorbing Africans into the economy? And of course, although there are many Africa's families are growing faster than anywhere else, but there are also countries and economies that are not even meeting the replacement rate of children. And are in desperate need of more people crossing their borders.
Yeah, so this is it's a tricky one to answer, because on the one hand, the West, with its declining birth rates and its lack of labor, needs to encourage kind of migrations to act as an economic stimulus. But politically, so that's from an economic perspective. But politically,
right.
That's a very difficult sell in
exactly.
the current context. So you've got this massive conundrum over here. And if you look at young workers and geographic proximity, where do they come from? They come from Africa. Again, really hard sells. And this is where it gets really interesting, because I would say the key kind of policy areas where this is going to play out is in the tech landscape, the trade landscape, and then talent. And I think global powers are going to be competing in these 3 areas, and it's going to become a serious area for competition. Now,
so tech, trade, and talent. So talent would be the competition for people. Tech would, I understand, would be the IP of groundbreaking new technologies. What would trade be?
Just generally with a more insular kind of outlook, America first, reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring.
Okay.
And more integration in Africa with the Continental Free Trade Agreement. And given the critical minerals that we have and the resources that we have, I think this is going to become another area of serious contestation. So I think those will be areas to watch going forward. I think the reality is that policymakers in Africa and even global powers need to create the right incentives on the continent to prevent kind of both skilled immigration and forced migration. To other parts of the world, because we do need to retain our human capital. And so I think, you hear all the stories in Nigeria. They've got a word for it called Japa, where, swathes of skilled Nigerians have emigrated to Canada and places like that, just because of the dysfunction that they've experienced back home. In South Africa, we had many waves of brain drain, but I think that's starting to reverse now, anecdotally from what I'm hearing. And I think, governments can do a lot here to invest in things like diaspora schemes to incentivize skilled migrants who have gone abroad to come back to start businesses, to invest their talent and their capital, particularly in a context where increasingly migrants are feeling less and less welcome in established hubs in Europe, in the States, and places like that, where passport privilege and visa access is becoming more of a thing and far more onerous. So I think, the reality is that Africa needs to work to keep its people. In the absence of that, they're going to seek greener pastures elsewhere. And that's becoming more and more difficult to do in the current political environment. So I don't know how this shakes down, but I do think it requires a concerted effort, because otherwise we're going to keep losing our best and brightest people, our best and brightest innovations from a tech perspective, and we are going to suffer the economic consequences of that.
You also point out there that others are competing for skills. It is a zero-sum game. It's not that we can just ignore it and it will go away. Someone else will benefit if we don't protect and be careful about it. Another, not quite zero-sum game, but certainly when America coughs, the world gets a cold. Joe Biden is being succeeded this year. Do you think of the two parties, there's any particular Africa implication that you're aware of or worried about or possibly advising over? And although neither Harris nor Trump appear globalist, Trump seems to me to be the more outwardly nationalist, if I could put it that way. Is that your read? What would your expectations be? And I don't know if there is a prediction model that you've been looking at. Where do you think we'll land by the end of the year?
Yeah, look, I'm not gonna hazard a guess on who's gonna win the US election, because as we know, it comes down to just a few states in the electoral college. Yeah. But I do think the greater concern is obviously if Trump wins from an African perspective, because he is erratic, he is unpredictable, and the rules-based order will not apply. And we kind of have some evidence of that in his first term. So if we break it down into kind of the key risk factors, first we look at financial markets. And from that perspective, I think what would Trump's policy signal to the market? What does it mean for the dollar? What does it mean for the Fed and its hiking cycle, right? So we know that his kind of economic doctrine is America first, deregulation, laissez-faire economics, fiscal spending would all be key components of that. And I think what that could probably do is lead to an inflationary spike. Consequently, the Fed needs to intervene, and consequently that kind of means a stronger dollar and negative contagion on emerging markets. Then, of course, the other aspect is in terms of the trade policies, and we know we've got evidence of trade wars and tariffs and protectionist measures. And if that had to reemerge, where he's talking about a 60% tariff on Chinese goods and a 10% on all global tariffs, that's clearly going to have implications for global trade, for supply and demand, for supply chains and trade channels. So clearly a concern. From a multilateralism and governance and a globalism perspective, he pulled out of the Paris Accord the first time. We know he's a climate skeptic, and Africa is disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change. Even though it's barely contributed to carbon emissions. So again, these are all going to force a rethink of how African sovereigns navigate a world of Trump and his unpredictability. They're going to need to kind of come up with trade strategies, with kind of domestic solutions to how they can insulate their economies from the damaging consequences of Trumponomics. But then at the same time, strategic countries will play to his ego, because ultimately, if you can offer Trump something, he's a deal maker and he prioritizes return on investment. And if you can work through the Russia and China lens, which is historically what has happened, and create opportunities for commercial actors in operating in Africa, then I think they might be able to get some joy. But I think on balance, the consequences of a Trump presidency would be quite bad for African countries.
Yeah, and I guess you're also there able to articulate a list of the risks we know he'll bring. So in some ways, he's got known risks. One of the feedback points I received recently was, we can't really speak poorly of Harris, but we can't speak well of her yet either. So there's unknown risks that she'll bring. We just hope that they're less, less affecting than another Trump presidency. I really enjoyed the risk analysis you've done. I followed, I didn't quite follow you into RMB, but I became a banker a short while afterwards, and always enjoyed how you've thought through the world and been able to articulate positions on countries, and then even down to company level. I'd quite like to understand on a personal level, what are the barriers you faced? What was the hardest part of your job? How was it, or what were a few of the hurdles you had to vault over to progress from Joburg city boy to London director of risk at Signal?
Look, generally speaking, I am very fortunate. I love what I do. I am privileged. I travel the world, and I don't think I have real issues in my life compared to a lot of people. I love the work I do and the people I work with. So I'm very, very fortunate. I think the one thing that has been difficult over the past few years is, when you move countries, there is something that changes in you as a person. And, I went from being a big fish in a small pond, doing relatively well, to being a small fish in a massive ocean. And, when you move countries, the stuff that works back home doesn't necessarily work abroad. It's much harder, much more competitive. The culture of how people relate is different. And that really forces a lot of introspection and a lot of growth. And I think there's a part of you that is like, have I made the right decision? Have I not? And navigating this kind of space can often be a hard and lonely journey. And so, like I said to you, I've got an appreciation for what South Africa is and what it isn't. It's an amazing country with an amazing set of people where, humanity is celebrated. I went through a bit of a visa debacle a couple of years ago, trying to get my UK visa extended. And, that really taught me a lot because patience is not my strong suit. I like to get on a plane. It's a big part of my work. And, I couldn't travel for 7 months. And I was obviously very frustrated. Every day felt like Groundhog Day. But what it did force me to do is to recognize that, travel is a privilege, not a right. I was taking flights like Ubers, and there's a reason that these things happen, and there's a lesson somewhere. And I think what I've learned living in a different country, interacting with people who are very different and very diverse, in a culture that I guess is not necessarily a warm culture and doesn't resonate with my personality, you've learned to be resilient, and you learn to kind of learn lessons and think about your life in various chapters, and just to appreciate things for what they are and live in the present. So I think if the things I've learned and the experiences I've had living in the UK have really grown me. And as I often reflect, and my life would have been a lot easier if I stayed in SA, but I wouldn't change it for anything, because the growth has been very rewarding.
Sure. I can only imagine parts of it being difficult in that regard. I suppose that the obvious other difficulties, your job is to predict the future to some degree. It sounds quite challenging. What is I'm curious, what is the most disruptive idea or trend or counterintuitive fact that you've come across recently? What is something that's not quite shocked you maybe, but might shock someone like me?
I don't know if it's necessarily shocking or counterintuitive, but the one area that I am looking at quite closely is this area of the purple economy in Africa as an opportunity set.
The purple economy.
Yeah. So basically, it's the art, sport, creative, fashion, music economy where I think it's poised for an explosion, and I think the commercial opportunities are huge. Because what we've seen is, from Afrobeats becoming global phenomena, Trevor Noah hosting The Daily Show, African fashion and music and art and culture going global. I think there's an opportunity here to turn this industry, which is kind of not really structured, into something like K-pop in Korea, which kind of generates over $10 billion a year for that economy. So, that's something that I'm thinking about quite closely, is how do you make the shift from small scale young African artists to turning this into an industry which is sustainable, scalable, build the infrastructure around it. Because what we have seen is a shift where instead of African talent going global, you're seeing the world coming to Africa. And I think there's huge opportunity there to leverage the human capital and human potential and to turn this into a multi-billion-dollar industry, which again can create employment opportunities and create a whole industry infrastructure which can be commercialized.
Now, Ronak, I'm curious. You just said the opportunity is for people who are coming to Africa rather than taking Africa to the world, or to some degree that I guess both are opportunistic or available. Do you see the role of African leaders, be they private or public sector, sort of delivering a message about Africa that's a bit more unified? Is that a gap in the market as it perhaps existed when you were building on country risk from South Africa, into the rest of the continent? And where would you think that maybe amplification of African voices should go? Where is the obvious need for more information about what's happening on the continent?
Yeah, I think if anything, if the events of the last few years have shown us anything, is that nobody is going to come and rescue African countries and African people. From vaccine hoarding to the approach to debt and climate, I think we are in an era where self-interest dominates. And I think the message then to African leaders loud and clear is that, Africa needs to bet on itself. And to do that, you need to be smart and strategic and hack the ladder. Because if you look at the continent's dilemma, where it's being asked to democratize and industrialize simultaneously, doing so in a context of premature deindustrialization, while still going green, the development model has to be very different to the rest of the world because we don't have the luxury of time. And, given the growth rates of the youth population and the demographics, you've got to industrialize quickly. And so the path needs to be unconventional. And, in my presentations and in my classes, I often talk about this approach of smart cuts, which is shortening the ladder to success, based on a book by Shane Snow, and how, these opportunities can be created. And for me, integration, particularly the Continental Free Trade Agreement, is something that needs to be worked on. Intra-Africa trade is only 15%. And if you look at the themes that emerged in the wake of the pandemic, localization, digitization, green transition, I think all of them speak to the point that we need stronger and more integrated domestic regional markets. Innovation, I've just mentioned the purple economy, but you've also got the flat white economy. You've got the gray economy, the blue economy, the green economy, where we know that in Africa, innovation is driven by necessity, and that's a big comparative advantage. So doubling down on that, I think, is important. And then, of course, industrialization, hard, soft, and digital infrastructure is critical for that. But I think more importantly, Africa is now becoming sexy to many global powers and is being courted by global powers. And we need to play our cards right to seize these opportunities. And so speaking with a collective voice, speaking with the collective gravitas of one voice, whilst very difficult, becomes really important, because that's when you can throw your weight around and achieve scale and exercise your economic and diplomatic muscle and really start to make an impact. So I would say it's a case of being smart and strategic, and then also using the collective power to achieve scale.
Sure. Well, that's really insightful, and particularly the comment you made on lobbying as a unified front, as Africa being presented with perhaps not one voice, but certainly with one intent. I can't believe it's only 15% intra-trade. That's unbelievable. And could I ask, for my own knowledge, I think I could get the blue, green, and now purple economy. But what is the flat white economy? Is that beverages, coffees?
So, I mean, the name comes from, obviously coffee shops and digital natives. So it very much refers to the digital economy.
Okay.
I think it was.
That's lovely.
if I'm not mistaken, I think it was coined in Kenya, where obviously digital literacy and innovation is huge over there, with the likes of Silicon Savannah and a lot of the innovations that we've seen coming out of places like Nairobi. So yeah, that's the flat white economy, is the digital economy in Africa.
That's amazing. I'll do my best to use it going forward. I want to ask you just one more question, Ronak, and then we'll let you go. Thanks so much for being with us. It's I've learned with every answer you give. I've taken more notes. But maybe a final question. What should I have asked you today? What if you had some time on a pod with no host, and you were just going to say or talk to the most important part of your job, or perhaps the most interesting trend, and I didn't get the opportunity to ask you the right question? What would that be? What would you tell us about today?
I think you've been pretty good, Ben. I think you've covered most bases. But look, I think that there are a couple of things that always come up, right? So the climate story, the climate conundrum, and how that is going to play out. And I think, I always say the framing of this is important. It comes down to 3 F words. It's framing, it's fairness, and it's financing, because there is a big disconnect between the way the industrialized world views climate justice and climate development versus the global south. And you're starting to hear narratives of climate colonialism and resource nationalism emerging. And there's obviously huge opportunities for leapfrogging benefits, but then at the same time, how do you balance that with economic and social justice? So I think that's an interesting area that is gonna dominate the discourse for a while. I think the other thing that always tends to come up in these types of interviews is the global south. And what is the global south? What does it mean? What does it look to achieve? How do African continents interface with that? I think is interesting. And obviously it's not geographic, it's geopolitical. So that's an interesting one. And then you didn't ask me when I'm moving back to South Africa.
Yeah, tell us.
I think it will be sooner rather than later.
Wow, fantastic. You mentioned earlier that there's a brain drain reversal. You said it's anecdotal. I can agree with that. I was in touch with someone recently whose business is to transport pets into the UK and out of the UK, so from South Africa to the UK. And for the first time in his, I think it's 18 years, he's now booking more trips to take dogs to South Africa than the other way around.
Fascinating.
So I guess the dog index would agree with your anecdote. Thank you so much, Ronak. It's been such a pleasure and a privilege to engage with you for this period, and really enjoyed having you on the pod.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Ben. Really enjoyed the discussion, and look forward to chatting again soon.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Shapers, Makers, Builders and Breakers. We trust that you've been encouraged by what you've just heard. Subscribe to future episodes and find out more about us at shaperspodcast.co.za. That is shaperspodcast.co.za.
Well, that's right. Don't forget to subscribe for new episodes and other content, and remember, share any feedback with us. We'd love to hear from you. Find me on Twitter at b_d_shaw or via email. We look forward to your company the next time on Shapers, Makers, Builders and Breakers. Until that time, cheers, bye-bye.